thank you very much. We changed gear back to CML, and it's always very difficult, the topic of when to consider a transplant in these patients. If I was talking to a CML audience, almost everybody will say never, although it's something that features in every single recommendation, in every single ELN and NCCN guidelines. And of course, even today we heard that transplantation should be considered in some cases, including in my preceding case. So what I'd like to do is use one of my patients who eventually didn't get to a transplant as an illustration on how difficult it is to actually make the right decision at the right time. So let's go to the beginning. She was diagnosed with chronic phase CML at the age of 39. She was a highly active professional, still is, works as a director for HR in a multinational company. And you can see the figures there at presentation, some high-risk features, which gave her a relatively high-risk so-called score. You could argue that she may have been offered a different TKI to start with, but this is beyond this presentation. She was definitely started on 400 milligrams of imatinib, although she developed a little bit of neutropenia that was overcome with G-CSF, and she did initially very well, achieving a complete cytogenetic remission at 12 months. However, the PCR refused to go below 0.1%, and she was not in MMR at 18 months. So we can say she was in a suboptimal response at that time. She was in CCR, but because of a slight rise in the PCR, she underwent analysis, screening for mutation, and we detected an M351T. This is not the famous 315I mutation, and because of this reason, she was changed to dasatinib. Following this, on dasatinib, she didn't improve very much, and at some point a bone marrow was performed a year or so later, and that showed loss of complete cytogenetic remission, which was confirmed in a marrow some time later. So this patient did not do well with the switch to dasatinib, and indeed, because again, a slightly raised on PCR, she underwent a second screening for mutation, and this time we found an F317L mutation, which is resistant to dasatinib. Now, I could ask the audience the question, what would you do now? But will not waste my ammunition with that question. I will tell you exactly what we did. She was branded as failure to second-generation TKI with a resistant mutation, but nevertheless, she was switched to nilotinib. On nilotinib, she's done extremely well, and the mutation has disappeared, and she's now achieved on 2 consecutive occasions a major molecular remission, and she remains well. Now, the question I'd like to ask the audience is, if after following the clinical history of this patient, would you think there is any particular point during the evolution that was not an indication for allogeneic stem cell transplantation? So time of the first mutation, time of the loss of CCR, time of the new mutation, which is a bit more resistant, or at the end when she has finally achieved an MMR with nilotinib. Any of this which is not an indication for transplant, please vote. Well, 50% of the audience thinks that each one of those time points were an indication for transplantation, although that's different from actually taking the patient to transplant. And there's a number of people in the audience who think that at the end, having tried 3 different TKIs, if we get there, if the MMR has been achieved, then that time point is not the right time to offer this patient a transplant. Now, in my opinion, all of them, including the last one, should be considered as potential indications for transplantation. Now, when we talk about transplantation, we first have to set the scene with the current numbers. These are EBMT activity for transplant, and I'd like to draw your attention, if I may, to this part of the curve. Obviously, the numbers have dropped since the advent of TKIs, but this part of the curve indicates that, at least at the EBMT, we're doing more and more transplants in advanced phase disease. This is accelerated phase, second chronic phase, and blast crisis, than patients reaching the transplant in first chronic phase. And to me, this is clearly a failure of us as clinicians to try and bring the patient to transplantation before the blast crisis has developed. Now, we also think about the results of transplantation, the early mortality and the long-term survival. We have in our heads something like this figure, which is an adaptation of the initial EBMT, Alois-Grathwohl EBMT score, adaptation for chronic phase. And of course, we think if the patient has an EBMT which is score which is low, the survival should be in the order of 80 to perhaps even 90%. And if the EBMT score is higher, then the indication for transplantation may be weaker. Now, I wonder how many of you, when I asked the question, had time to make this calculation in your head about how the EBMT score would be for this woman. Of course, you wouldn't, because I have not told you anything about the potential donor, and you need to know the donor to actually make the final score. Now, remember, she was diagnosed at the late 30s, so if you had indicated the transplant early after the first problems with the imatinib or even the dasatinib at the time of loss of CCR, for instance, she would have scored just 1 point because she would be 40 years old. Assume she had an HL-identical brother. The interval between diagnosis and transplant is always more than 12 months, so you always score a point. And because she's female, the last point doesn't apply to her. So she will score 2 points, and then she would have an estimated survival of around 70 to 75% at 5 years. However, if you wait longer and she goes well over 40%, she scored 2 points. Assuming she didn't have a sibling, then we have to find an unrelated. That's another 2 points. Added to the 1 point you get for waiting more than 12 months, that's 5 points, and 5 points will put her in the lower curve. So these calculations need to be done at least with the patient before making a final decision. Now, this data are based on results in the late 90s or early 90s. Has progressed in more favorable results, and as you can see in these graphs here, I've just taken from the CML-4 study, which included early transplantation for those imatinib failures. Excellent results if you make the transplant as early as possible or as early as the indication appears for transplantation.